Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. This webinar is the second in a series of discussions that NSPN, which is the National Science Policy Network, has been hosting, where we're looking at bringing in international perspectives to different global issues. The National Science Policy Network is an organization that provides training and programs for scientists from early career to later in their career who are interested in policy or in diplomacy. And so it also provides opportunities for these scientists to engage in policy writing, in advocacy, in diplomacy, working together in community, among other opportunities that NSPN provides. In the first round of this series, what we did was talk to a nonprofit entity. We talked to somebody who was a PhD student, and we talked to somebody who had started a business where they were using artificial intelligence in agriculture in Western Africa. And so that video is on our YouTube channel, which I'll provide a link for later on for anybody who's interested. But for today, I'd like to thank Aditi and Anastasia for all their work in getting this panel put together, getting invitations sent out, and putting questions together for our panelists. Today's panel takes us to India, where we'll be looking at India's work in the clean energy transition. And our panelists will be discussing the work from different perspectives that they bring to the table, and providing a glimpse into where the country has been, where it is right now, and then the challenges and the opportunities that are available as it moves towards a cleaner energy future. I'll pass it on now to our moderator, Anastasia, who's a data scientist at the Pacific Northwest National Lab and also a Science Diplomacy Committee member here at NSPN. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Ope. And thank you, Aditi, who is also here today and as mentioned, helped organize the event. It's been such a good time working with you all to be able to host today's speakers on the topic of India's clean energy transition. And clean energy has been central in many of my projects at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory because I often analyze and help create data tools and processing frameworks for clean energy projects like next generation nuclear fuels and geothermal. So I'm excited to engage with speakers on not just the innovations of sustainable energy, but also the economics and policy of it. So I'm really curious to better lay out the energy landscape in India, because India has surged as a solar superpower, and there was this massive rollout of renewables until COVID lockdowns. And so there seems to now be this call for greater investment or a larger political front to respond to still growing dependence on coal and fossil fuels. And so today our speakers will bring the latest context on India's clean energy transition. It's a topic that was sparked by a collaboration between the Science Diplomacy Committee and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee at NSPN, and whose event will be later made available on NSPN's YouTube channel. So with that, I'm eager to start by welcoming our speakers. I'm thrilled to have you here today to share your perspectives, and I will briefly introduce each speaker and then let them take the stage for their own introductions before diving into some questions. So first, we have Kanchi Gupta, who's a senior associate for the India program at Climate Works Foundation, where she's working to advance strategic thinking and grant making with regard to India. She works closely with regional partners on highlighting climate mitigation opportunities in India, such as in clean transportation, with a focus on electrification of small, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles. She also leads programmatic work on promoting just and equitable zero-emission mobility, and she has a background in international relations. And she has worked at a think tank in Delhi, researching India as a regional power. We also have here today Dr. Karthikey Singh, who's the director of the Global Energy Futures Initiative at the Climate Imperative Foundation, where he manages the portfolio to support energy transition efforts around the world. He does so by leveraging his extensive experience being in or engaging with government, research institutions, intergovernmental organizations, civil society, and industries in the sustainable development sector. He has traveled from the Arctic to the Antarctic, exploring the challenges of energy geopolitics in a changing climate. Karthikey has a background in ecology and sustainable development with a Master's of Engineering Science from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and his PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Finally, we have Dhruv Warrior, who is a research analyst at the Technologies for Transition team at the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, or CEEW, and his work focuses primarily on energy storage and renewable energy supply chains. He has previously worked at the CEEW Center for Energy Finance and worked with Vortig India in the quality control and supply chain management of heavy equipment manufacturing. At the Council, Dhruv tracks key market and technological developments in energy storage and develops business models and policy recommendations to enable the creation of resilient, responsive, and responsible renewable energy supply chains in India and the Global South. And so with that, I want to warmly welcome you all and hand off introductions to each of you in the same order, starting with Karthikey Gupta.
Thank you so much for that, Anastasia. So as was in my introduction, I just want to start off by saying I'm representing myself. All the views over here are mine, not my organization. So I'll introduce myself and a little bit of my work and my priorities. So as was in my introduction, in my past life, I worked at a think tank in Delhi, where I was researching India as a regional power. So I did a lot of open source research and analyses on the geopolitical, economic, and security trends in South and West Asia. I love writing, so I also wrote a lot of blogs, opinion pieces, and reports, and I took up opportunities to do speech writing and talking points for the senior leadership at my organization and sometimes government officials. And I also managed external collaborations and stakeholder engagement. So I built partnerships with stakeholders and expert voices in academia, civil society, and government. So this was my past life. In my current life, I work at a philanthropy where I work with multiple partners to advance climate goals in India in line with India's development objectives. So what does this entail? We have three broad goals. One is to create an enabling environment for collaborations between all stakeholders. So whether it is philanthropic institutions, academia, think tanks, expert voices, public and private sector stakeholders to promote strategic thinking vis-a-vis India. The second is supporting institutions that are at the forefront of providing scientific and data-backed research on decarbonization pathways, opportunities, and scenarios in India, which can be vital entry points for action. And the third is supporting implementation of these priorities. So one of the examples, which was also in my bio, is promoting equitable and inclusive clean mobility, so primarily electrification. And some of the projects that I'm working on are at the intersection of driving adoption, ownership, and productive use of clean EVs, also amongst women entrepreneurs in rural India, and also looking at other opportunities like improving access to finance for EV ownership. I just want to end by saying, why did I make this shift? So there are multiple reasons. One was moving countries, some personal developments, but I think one key reason for me was that even though I love foreign policy, I think I was beginning to get a little bit restless around what was the uptake and the direct impact of my work. So I wanted to work on issues that directly affect people, livelihoods, and overall well-being. So everything that I know about climate change, energy, and clean technologies, I've learned on the job, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be working in this sector. And thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet you and great to have you here today. And now we'll hear from Dr. Karthikey Singh.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm Karthikey, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm sort of thinking about my own reflections. I guess I should also echo what Kanchi said. The views expressed here are my own, not my institution's. Thanks for a reminder of that. I think that's very important. We all have our own sort of opinions beyond our institutions and ideas, of course. I'm an ecologist by training. That is something that I studied in college, wildlife management very specifically. And I would say that the sort of inflection point for me to sort of think about the intersections of conservation and broader energy transition happened at a field experience in Kenya, where the EU had provided financing for the Maasai community to to set up solar-powered electric fencing to shield their livestock and crops from the damages that they can suffer from wildlife that were spilling beyond the Amboseli National Park. And I think that was a really interesting moment for me because there was so much human-wildlife conflict, and I care so deeply, even still, about the sort of imperative to protect wild spaces and the ecologist in me, that I think I realized that I needed to focus more on energy and human development needs so that there can be space for wildlife. I think later in my career, obviously that shaped me, and my doctoral work, my field work, all sort of focused on energy access for rural areas, which was continues to be a persistent challenge in many parts of the world, but for a geography like India, where I was born and where I have strong links, that was a pronounced sort of problem as one large market of largely unelectrified people, which also has a lot of charismatic megafauna and conservation needs. So that's kind of where my academic journey ended up taking me, was the sort of what factors affect the scaling up of off-grid solar technologies in particular, because the communities that use them are often living in the margins of protected areas. And this probably speaks to the experience of some of the folks in the National Science Policy Network. It was actually an ORISE fellowship during the data analysis and writing phase of my dissertation that brought me to the US Department of Energy, squarely into the International Affairs Office, where I had the privilege of helping manage the US India and US Pakistan bilateral energy portfolios, and had basically a front row seat into what energy diplomacy looks like between the United States and two key partners, all in the same neighborhood. And I think obviously I'd always been interested in environmental diplomacy and diplomacy at large, ended up going to a school of diplomacy after a school of environment. But that, I think, sort of culminated for me kind of the area that I've been really interested in. And in my work, I would say the stuff that I find really exciting is activating diplomacy networks to aid in our collective energy transition through the work of our partners, and activating that in different corners of the world, because there are, as we transition into this new industrial climate-aligned economy, we need to think about new trade alliances and new ways of cooperation and globalization, and on the basis of these new types of technologies. So thanks for having me. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Karthikey. It's great to have you here today as well and hear about your background. And next we'll hear from Drew Warrior.
Yeah, hi. Great to hear from the two of you, Kanchi and Karthikey. I think I would say my story in this whole space is a lot earlier than the both of you, but I think the kind of motivations are quite similar in terms of why I came into the space, and also reiterating, just like Kanchi and Karthikey said, the ideas I share today, or the thoughts I share today, are my own. I'm not representing my institution, but of course, my institution has is a lot of the reason that I'm here, and a lot of the reason that the work that I do has, reached the kind of people that I wanted to. Just a background on CEW, the council. What we do is we try to impact sustainable development at scale with data, integrated analysis, and strategic outreach. And basically, we look at it in terms of three broad areas. One is transformations, where we try to transform the Indian economy. The second is improving quality of life in terms of Indian citizens. And then the third is looking at enablers in terms of what is needed to actually enable the two other transformations and improvements in quality of life. We have a 200 plus multidisciplinary team, and we have offices in multiple states across India. So we try and so even though we're a think tank based out of New Delhi, we try and actually go down into various states. We go down to the state offices, and we try and make change where it needs to happen. So whether that's at the state level, whether that's on ground. So there's a lot of teams that work on ground as well. So my story with CW actually began with the Center for Energy Finance. That's where I came in. And of course, my motivation there was, finance being a very important part of enabling the energy transition. And I had the opportunity to work on various aspects, including managed charging, manufacturing, and then also some amount of thermal repurposing and coal repurposing. But what our team realized was that technology and innovation which very often are treated as, in India especially, second fiddle, where the assumption is we're going to import the technology and then deploy it. What we realized is that's really where the change needs to happen. And there's so much potential for India to become a leader in terms of RE supply chains, in terms of critical minerals, and in terms of technology at the global stage. So what we've done is we've created a new practice, and the name of basically the team is Technologies for Transitions. And we try to focus on these kind of aspects. And so that's really where my background is. My background's really I'm a mechanical engineer. I worked in manufacturing. I've really developed that kind of an understanding, looking at it from an RE supply chain lens. And I think that's where sometimes the discussion kind of stops, where it's just about deployment. And it's very useful to then start looking upstream, and especially in global South countries and countries where let's say the technology is not so mature yet and where costs are quite low. So I think that's really where I'm coming from, and hopefully I can add to the discussion, but I'm also quite looking forward to learning a lot from Kanchi and Karthikey, given their wide experience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dhruv. And thank you so much to everyone again who's joining us today. I'm excited to hear about your work and perspectives on the clean energy transition in India. So we're going to open up and dive into some questions. And where I'm going to start is I'm going to more likely aim for 5 questions in this webinar, with maybe 2 optional questions depending on time. And so I want to also say that I'm going to encourage a lot of discussion. I want you to feel like you can ask questions to other speakers and you can respond to each other if you feel inspired by what a speaker says. So with that, I want to kind of launch this and start with my first question, which is one that reminds me a lot of the large energy goals I hear at conferences and in mission and strategy statements, which will revolve around a nation's energy goals. In particular, India has several upcoming goals for its clean energy sector, including reducing the carbon intensity of its economy by 45% by 2030 compared to its 2005 levels, and meeting 50% of its energy requirements with renewable energy sources by 2030. I'm curious to discuss some of the opportunities these goals present for the public and private sector, and the challenges that might be lurking as the nation works to achieve them. So to start off, what are your thoughts on India's climate goals? And I would like to direct this by going in reverse order, starting with Dhruv.
Sure, thanks, Anastasia. So I'd say first word is ambitious. And I think especially with the updated goals, the ones that were announced recently, I think India is really trying to be in that top tier of countries in terms of actually creating change. So what some of CW's work, some of my colleagues, the work they've done, they've seen that 47% of reduction in carbon intensity of the economy is kind of possible, and India's goals are already at that level. One of India's goals, which isn't really in the NDC, is to hit 500 gigawatt by 2030 of renewable energy. And just as a reminder, that's more than the current entire capacity of India's generation mix. And so what we are trying to do is actually more than double the RE capacity on the grid. And not only that, I think when you're talking about opportunities, as you said, solar is really the heart of the story. So of course, there are other technologies, and I hope we discuss those as well. But if you look at the trends in the last few years, it's really been solar, and hopefully we move on to hydro and wind. But solar, as you know, is quite a low capacity utilization factor, and it only generates a certain time. So unless you have energy storage on the grid, which will need to be produced and put out at like scales which are much, much bigger than anything that exists on the grid today, there's no way for that solar, which is going to come in as capacity, to be able to actually, work its way into bringing down the carbon intensity of the grid. So I think not only do we need to more than double the size of the capacity on the ground, you also need to work on putting up energy storage, and then of course looking into green hydrogen and those technologies, because there are hard to abate industrial sectors. So it's going to be a huge task for us. And yeah, I think if we pull it off, I think that'll be really good.
Yeah, infrastructure wise, that's a massive goal. Kanchi, what are your thoughts?
Sure, thank you. I echo a lot of what Dhruv said, but I just want to like sort of zoom out the lens a little bit and say the first thing is the context when we talk about India's climate goals. And I think it's important to consider the fact that India is now the world's 5th largest economy. So it's jumped 6 positions in the last 10 years. Half of the country's population, which is like 650 million people, are below the age of 25. So rapid industrialization is a priority in India. The manufacturing sector needs to grow alongside the service sector economy. India has rapidly growing energy needs. So there is a very large development mandate. There's a need to create jobs, there's a need to lift people out of poverty and guarantee an improved quality of life for 1.4 billion citizens. So I think we need to have that as a context whenever we talk about India's climate goals and where we are. The second, as Dhruv said, is ambition. So, 2022 was a hard year, 21-22 was a hard year for many countries coming out of COVID. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but it was an especially hard year for India. And there's a lot of still social and economic effects that are being felt. But with COP26, there were some good, ambitious commitments. Following that, there were the updated NDCs in 22. There was, which is also known as a Panchamrit, the 5 nectars. There's a net zero target by 2070 and scale commitments for renewable energy deployment and emissions reductions. So I think there is a national policy framework which kind of lays a very strong foundation for achieving the NDCs and exceeding the NDCs potentially. But within this, there is also the challenge of adapting to climate change and the imperative of building resilience. So I think in 2022, there was a very devastating heat wave that had a massive impact across the country. There were concerns around food security, wheat production plunged. There was a power crisis with spikes in demand, especially related to cooling. So these will only grow as extreme weather events become more common. So I think this concern needs to be weaved in when we talk about overarching climate goals, and also underscores the importance of accelerating clean energy transition. I think the third, which is mentioned a lot less, is also the role that India plays in terms of the international conversation around climate change. India has, I think, played a bit of a role in providing platforms and solutions for other countries in the global south. India has been an advocate for low carbon transitions in the global south countries, which balance emissions reductions with development. It's also been a leading voice in terms of mobilizing green finance. So I think this is something that needs to be considered when we talk about India's overall climate action. I think one example of that is the International Solar Alliance, which is kind of a venue for deploying infrastructure, technology, and finance to other countries. India extends lines of credits to for solar and clean energy projects in emerging economies. In terms of resilience, there's the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. I think a new initiative is the LIFE mission, the Lifestyles for Environment mission. Though a lot of it needs to be unpacked, but it's kind of like encouraging behavioral change at the civil society, public sector, and private sector levels. So it can sort of be more of a unifying call for action. So I think India continues to be a leading voice in the global south, and I think it can create a template for low carbon economic growth for emerging economies. So something to be considered. I'll stop there.
Thank you. No, that's great. You really stratify all the sectors and kind of how they work together with their priorities. Karthikey, what are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, talk about layering on to layers that were added by Kanchi. I guess I can reflect back to, when India was starting down this track, the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change that I think came about sometime around 2007 or slightly prior, and thinking through where we were technologically at that time, and also the targets the government had set for things like the National Solar Mission. They were, looking back now, of course, seemed quite anemic at that time when solar technologies were, more cost prohibitive. Maybe seemed ambitious, and just sort of thinking through how quickly things changed, not only from a cost competitiveness of clean energy, but also how market signals also help drive that, right, from different corners of the world and where manufacturing really took off east of India, and how that 20 gigawatt initial target was ratcheted up to be 100 gigawatts, and with some sort of ambitious end date, and what we see now in terms of ratcheting it up even more. And I think that more important than, and you may ask this question at some point about whether or not the target has been met or what we feel about it, but I think that shooting for the moon and breaking through a ceiling at least is a very critical piece of the puzzle here in terms of having ambition. And for that, I think there's a lot to be said about the targets the country's setting. I think there is a geopolitical angle to this, as Kanchi was alluding to. There's the Solar Alliance, of course. There's the one sun, one world, one grid effort, which sort of aims to, I think, harness India's experience in unifying its national grid for the first time ever, linking the various different regional grids and the North and South interconnect, and thinking through what it means to have greater interconnection in the South Asia region and beyond into ASEAN, and really leverage the cheapest, greenest electron from one place to another. For a country that is, heavily import dependent on fuel oils, but sits atop, considerable coal reserves, which, it must use for energy security reasons, but at its own peril, right? In terms of the heat wave that was referred to, or, the food security and other impacts that this may have, a changing climate will have on India's economy and growth ambition. So it's walking a tightrope, I would say. And I think in order to fully sort of lean in to the energy transition and its energy targets, it really requires making sure that while the targets are set, that the institutions and the players that are within India are aligned, right? I mean, you have multiple ministries that are at the helm of answering or perhaps jockeying for space in who is managing the energy transition, everything from a ministry of power to a ministry of new and renewable energy to a separate ministry that looks at hydropower to, other ministries tasked at looking at electric mobility and now green hydrogen. And so I think there's a lot, and I haven't even scratched the surface of center versus state dynamics and how this plays out. You can set a bold vision at the national level, but really the implementation is at the state level, and Indian states must be brought on board to meet that ambitious vision. So I think that institutional alignment matters. And I think from a science and policy perspective, it's critical, as I've seen it play out at the state level in India, as to which states are actually succeeding, leading or lagging in driving India's energy ambition, and the role that innovation can even play in not just passively administering an energy transition, but really being drivers of it and owning the value chain, which I think is seen as a critical piece of the puzzle post the pandemic. The last thing that I think I should mention is that other institutions that matter are those that are locked into the fossil fuel value chain. And I think those need to be brought along in the process. These targets should be met in part and seen as part and parcel of the transition of these institutions, so that they can continue to be economic drivers of India's future, not just sort of be left behind as we see so many conversations on just transition happening where we didn't account for those in the coal value chain to be brought along. I think there's a critical moment and a window here to bring those entities along as these targets are attempting to be met.
Yeah, thank you. I definitely want to get back to you on the state versus central dynamics and touch upon, the infrastructure and the adaptability question. And so maybe this question might give an opportunity to kind of scale back after we heard so much about what's happening right now and what have been the initiatives. And so this question might give an opportunity to maybe share some energy history. We've really been talking about India's trajectory, but given how close the dates are for some of these goals, 2030 is about 7 years away now. What are your observations about how far India has come since it set these goals at the Paris Agreement in 2015? Could you share more about kind of the history you've seen? And I'll start with Kanchi and then Karthikey and then Drew.
Thanks so much, Anastasia. So I'll say, I think, a lot of the key developments or the key progress points have been mentioned, but I'll just sort of put them all together. That's, the volume and pace of solar and wind construction, movement in the EV space, focus on manufacturing renewables components, early movement on clean technologies like green hydrogen. There is a battery manufacturing mission. On cooling, India just ratified the Kigali Amendment. So I think these are kind of like the big sort of key progress points that we've seen in the last few years. The second thing I'll say is that national policy efforts that have sort of galvanized the private sector, I think they continue to be, I think they've been key drivers of climate action in India and will continue to be critical as we go forward. So, these targets have kind of attracted foreign and domestic investments in the sector. They've sort of laid the groundwork for India to emerge as a solar manufacturing hub. There was the PLI scheme that was introduced in 2021, which provided incentives for setting up solar module plants in India as well as for EV manufacturing. And this has made manufacturing more cost competitive. I think some of the things that Karthikey and Dhruv also alluded to earlier. And so as there are greater financial incentives and support, India can be a very big player in diversifying supply chains globally. And I think there are some examples of these, like FDI investment in the renewable sector, I think was a cumulative of over $10 billion between 2015 and 2022. And I think India's module manufacturing capacity has doubled between 22 and 23, thanks to the PLI scheme. So India could actually become self-sufficient in solar module manufacturing in the next coming years. I think we've seen similar advances in the mobility sector. There's been policy and the private sector has followed. But I'll just make one additional point, which is on subnational action. So I think national action has to be supplemented by the states, and there are some efforts in this. I think over 20 states have finalized or notified EV policies. There are states like Karnataka and Gujarat, which have sort of been leading in overall preparedness and commitment to the transition to clean electricity. Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu have always been at the front runners of adding renewable energy capacity. Tamil Nadu has set up a governing council on climate and a green climate company. So there are several examples, but I think the point I want to make is states are going to be at the forefront of climate action in India, and they're going to be critical to meeting these goals, and they need to be supported through capacity building and access to funding in the future. I'll stop there.
No, I think that's great. And Karthikey, yeah, I'm really curious to hear about then what you would have to say about the states versus central dynamics.
Yeah, I mean, I think as with a place like the US, right, the states can really be the laboratories of innovation and really sent forth more sort of can provide a push to the center in terms of what's possible. And I think, going back a little bit to when the first electric vehicle and battery policy was released by Karnataka, and I remember there was a flurry. I was living in DC even at the time, and just thinking about trying to get a handle on what this policy says, and there was just this photocopied version of the document that somebody had put up online after there were lots of calls to kind of look at it closely. It was a first mover, and I think it doesn't surprise me because it is a state where India's Silicon Valley lies. There's a lot of tech innovation happening there. That is the place where India had a startup. Actually, I wouldn't even call it a startup by the time I engaged with it, but a firm that was manufacturing electric vehicles prior to Tesla even being on the scene and actually exporting to some 60 plus odd countries around the world. This was a company called Reva, started by Chetan Meni and co. And so I think they had the ability, and this was, by the way, in 2005 when they had probably launched. So that particular policy actually set the tone, I think, not just for what was needed in terms of electric mobility policy in the state, but what again was needed in terms of driving the innovation in electric mobility policy and energy storage technology policy, because they have in there the need for a battery innovation center and an R&D facility. And I think that's where you really, again, beyond just sort of manufacturing or sourcing components and assembling and deploying, you sort of start to build the blocks of the actual value chain more fundamentally. And I think that's, anyway, their policy really kind of kickstarted all the EV policies across the country. And as Kanchi mentioned, I think we're up to 20 states now. At one point when I was tracking this several years ago, it was only 7 or 8. So you can see how the progress has been made. I think more interesting is what we see in terms of the ability of certain states' renewable energy agencies in leading in terms of structuring projects for utility scale projects. And I think this is where the central Indian state of Madhya Pradesh really kind of was leading in terms of structuring with creative international finance mechanisms and tools and the resources they had, and a reverse auctioning process to really get solar prices to be rock bottom for a large utility scale solar project. And that kind of, again, set the tone for how India could achieve its large solar and perhaps wind ambitions. And so that's why I think the center versus state dynamic is an interesting one to watch. Beyond just being blessed in sun or wind, it's really about the institutions at the state level and who they are managed by, and the political will to really give that flexibility and drive the innovation in the business models and in thinking through long-term economic growth of capturing this industry. So that's what I would say about the center versus state dynamic. The only other thing I want to add here in terms of looking back at the history is in the last, I think probably by 2019, the government of India, in collaboration with the states, managed to successfully complete a long-standing vision, I think, since India's independence, which was to electrify every single home by extending wires and poles out to every single hamlet and home, and where communities were really remote, to have them have off-grid systems. And this is very interesting to me because obviously my PhD was looking at all the innovations in the firms that were coming up in the absence of a grid network, a unified grid network. And I think this presents a tremendous opportunity to leverage the increased demand, the latent demand for electrons, and the need for them to be as cheap and as clean as possible, into really driving and being a capture of India's sort of renewable energy ambitions. I think that's something that can't be divorced from this. Everywhere where we talk about decarbonization, electrification, and electrifying everything matters. So I think it's important to reflect on the fact that India did manage to do this. Now, of course, reliability and quality of power are the next, things to tackle through these wires. But it's certainly a tremendous business opportunity and has bearing on the sort of renewable energy plans and the energy demand of the country.
Great. Yeah. Diversification, innovation, electrification. What are your thoughts, Drew?
Yeah, I think one of the most important points, which is this interstate dynamic, has been covered by Kanchi and Karthikey at length. I think if we go back to 2015, and even if you look at the decade that's just passed, the whole story around the RE, let's say the RE revolution in India, was powered by the Solar Energy Corporation of India, SECI, and the whole model of being able to de-risk these investments, to be able to say that the center would be able to de-risk it and allow states to then purchase it when they need to. And that's really what kind of catalyzed, especially the solar revolution in the last few years. What we found though was that wind, for example, there were issues with the way that there has been a bit of difficulty in allowing wind to grow at the same rate. And so I think what has happened in the last 7 years has been this, what we've done is we've gone from, let's say, a nascent market to a somewhat mature market. And now I think the question comes, how do these institutions change? So what's some really exciting developments in the last few years is the realization, like I said before, about the need for energy storage. So organizations like NTPC, the National Thermal Power, I don't think they're the National Thermal Power Corporation anymore, they're just NTPC. So they're the big generation company of India. They've put out some tenders for energy storage, and what they're trying to do is figure out how to integrate all this RE that's come on board in the last few years, and also the RE that's going to come up in the next few years. And so you have these really interesting new market mechanisms which have started popping up in the last few years, which may not have existed earlier. The other thing is, of course, states are taking interest. So one, I think Gujarat, for example, had this really novel tender for energy storage. You have states like Telangana and Andhra Pradesh that are really, really pushing for pumped hydro. I think that's where they're focusing, and they're trying to incentivize a lot of developers, Greenco, for example, who might be wanting to come in and develop these technologies in India. So I think all of this has started happening, but just so we are on the same page. In the last year, 16 gigawatt of RE was added between 21 and 22. The year before that is about 12 gigawatt. In the next decade, we might need 300 gigawatt. So let's say this is a start in terms of how our journey is. It's a good start, but I think we'll need to accelerate. And then the second point is, I think, coming back to what Kanchi was saying, what Karthikey was saying, right, about homegrown and indigenization of these supply chains. So I think that's something that's a really interesting development. The PLI schemes, not just for batteries, but for solar modules, and there's interest in looking at PLIs for other technologies. There's even PLIs, for example, for automotive, where there's a separate focus on EVs and also for automotive components. So I think the governments really realize that manufacturing in India is going to be a huge part of the whole aspect of building out this huge RE, let's say, ecosystem that will have to be built. I think in the last few years, a lot of these changes have happened, and I think finally coming back to again, states, right? So discoms have really taken cognizance of this, and also again of the fact that they have this kind of variable RE on their grid. So be it because of solar rooftop and their policies, where again they've kind of gone from net metering to gross metering. So discoms have looked at that, but also I think they're looking to explore more options to actually integrate this kind of renewable energy. So that's also something that's happened over the past few years, where discoms have started looking into how they can integrate renewable energy into the grid. So that might even be something as simple as setting up energy storage, but also looking at managed charging options, vehicle to grid options. There's a lot of pilots happening on the ground today in terms of looking at these technological solutions. And also, of course, this will also require a lot of policy changes, which again, there's more movement, but let's say we just at the start of the new decade of changes here. Yeah, so that's basically my view on this.
Great. Yeah, thank you. It's really fascinating to hear about these new market mechanisms you walk through. It seems like renewables can be really reactive, but I want to jump into maybe some of the contradictions or uncertainties that can come along with that transition to clean energy. And so kind of notably, we're aware that there's this long-standing research on the variable nature of renewable energy from its storage to its year-on-year installations. However, there's also growing, many observations on the increasing volatility with fossil fuels, for example, on revenue. And yet fossil fuels continue to grow in India. Could you break down the uncertainties of fossil fuels compared to clean energy that you've observed in your line of work? And I'll direct this question back to Dhruv and then Kanchi and Karthikey.
Sure. So I think one place where I would say, first of all, India is a growing economy, and there's no way that we're going to separate these two. We're not going to be able to say that fossil fuels or RE, they're both going to be an important part of the economy for a while. I think that's quite clear in the way that these conversations are structured. But I think there are a few examples where I think these questions really come about. So one of them is natural gas and peaker plants. So given the way in which the dynamics in terms of the cost of peakers and natural gas have changed in India, there might be a huge argument for solar plus storage as an option to be able to take care of some of this peaking load, or even to be able to provide ancillary services. So in that case, I think there is an apples to apples comparison. I don't think it's always apples to apples to be able to compare fossil fuels to RE. But I think what's most important is that we look at where the cost competitiveness exists, and we ensure that the government is aware of it. So I think, for example, there's this very useful tender that's just come out. Maharashtra state had this tender where they are looking at solar plus storage, and they're looking at the times when solar is being used and the times that solar is not being used. Time that solar is being generated and times solar is not being generated. And what they've discovered was, I think, around 10 cents per kilowatt hour, so around 8 to 9 rupees for the non-solar times, which is quite similar to the lower end of natural gas in terms of cost. So I think in those kind of cases, when you realize that these kind of options, RE options, can displace some amount of fossil fuels, that might be an argument. But I think when it comes to domestic coal and domestic resources, I think that's much more a political issue. And I think that's not something you can compare apples to apples with the way that we're looking at the risk with RE. Yeah, that's my...
Great. Kanchi, what are your thoughts on some of the contradictions maybe you've come across?
Yeah, I think I interpret this question a little bit differently. I mean, I'm just kind of looking at the comparisons in terms of phasing out the fossil fuels and, deploying more clean energy technologies. I mean, I think we all know that India is quite heavily import dependent. I think India imports like 80% of its fossil fuel requirements. So there is a very big case for energy security to be made in India. And I think it's part of India's self-reliant mission to make India energy independent by 2047. The second point is demand in India is going to go up, something I said earlier as well. In power, about 8-fold, in the auto sector, about 3-fold, in the steel sector by 8-fold by 2050. So something to be considered for sure. But as we think about transitioning to clean technologies, their deployment hinges on a couple of developments, as we've spoken about. That is the increase in the deployment of solar and wind, electrolyzers for green hydrogen, and batteries for storage and EVs. So there are some challenges here. One is around the availability and supply security of critical minerals. And I think one of the discussions we've been having is the lithium find in India, but there are a lot of uncertainties there in terms of how much of it is proved reserves, what are the concerns around security, responsible mining, et cetera, that need to be figured out. But there are international strategic partnerships that can be developed to secure reserves. India can build recycling capacities, as it is already doing. I think the second consideration is the tax impacts from the loss of fossil fuel revenue. So fossil fuel taxes and duties, they contribute very significantly to state and central government revenues. I think it's about 12% of government revenue. But I think so as we phase out fossil fuel consumption, as we deploy more clean energy technologies, and the Indian economy is growing, so there are opportunities to offset this loss in the future. And of course, there are other considerations like the feasibility of new technologies like hydrogen, grid reliability, and securing supply chains, even as India is ramping up its own manufacturing capabilities. So I'll just give one example of the transportation sector, which I think is at the intersection of these uncertainties, but at the same time is ripe for mitigating fossil fuel insecurity and meeting clean energy goals. And I'm specifically going to quote some numbers from LBNL research, which I'm happy to share later in the chat. So if you look at battery electric trucks, specifically looking at freight, so battery electric trucks can have a lower total cost of ownership compared to diesel trucks. Diesel trucks currently consume 57% of petroleum that is used for transportation in India, the majority of which is imported. So electric trucks can definitely take advantage of the increase in renewable and domestically produced power. And as India is adding more renewable energy to the grid, there are also, of course, climate and pollution benefits. I'll stop there.
Okay, great, thank you. No, I think it's super informative to have these kind of facts listed. Otherwise, we kind of lose track of where we are in this transition. And so, Karthikey, what are your thoughts on the phase out in fossil fuels and maybe the contradictions you've come across?
Yeah, I mean, the contradictions are such, right? I mean, at the fundamental level, you have a country that the only fuel that it has, the only fuel stock that it has any sort of control over is coal. And it has to import, as Kanchi pointed out, oil and gas. It actually has a pretty thriving sort of petrochemicals processing industry. But at the end of the day, if it is put in a corner of tight energy security needs, the thing that India knows how to do is leverage its coal resources. And I think that that's why the transition and the contradiction, right? I mean, the need to act on climate for its own sort of stability and climate security, food security, and, you know, all the sort of productivity impacts that can come into play, and natural disasters that a country like India would suffer from as a changing climate. The need to sort of also be energy secure. All of these, what we're seeing is we're seeing the tension between the need to be energy secure at a time of great global energy insecurity driven by the war in Europe, and the need to sort of really act on climate, but yet not, you know, catching up in terms of owning as much of that value chain as possible. And this is where it's been interesting to see how much the production linked incentives and other things that have been put in place can really actually get India in a position where it is creating so much more of the technology that it needs for its electricity needs and electrifying as much as it can to buffer its population from the need to import oil and gas at the very least. Now, I mean, I think the more difficult thing that it will need to tackle is how it manages and navigates the phase down of coal, which it does sit on considerable reserves of. But as we've seen, you know, and I think driven in part by the fact that so much of the country is now electrified and there's demand and there's heat waves, that the energy demand is there, and even the coal isn't providing energy security in a way that I think one would expect it to. And that's obviously, there's a lag in terms of the ability of the infrastructure to keep up, the digging up of the stone and, you know, having it be transported across the country to power plants. All of that sort of makes it difficult to keep up with a rapidly changing climate and an energy system that can navigate it. So I think we're in this, you know, in the eye of the energy transition storm for India, as I like to say, where there is this, you know, how much longer will there be this need to hold on to coal? Obviously, for some time longer. But as it builds out the energy system of the future and leverages its sort of electrified networks, how much more can the Indian rupee be spent on Indians producing the technologies of the future is what we're doing. And this is where I think it's so critical. For the Coal Indias, for the NTPCs, for the BHEL, which is the engineering firm that produces power generation infrastructure, for Indian Oil, for all of them to become, because they're state-owned enterprises and by proxy, therefore, the government, and drive revenue that the state can benefit from, for them to own a piece of the energy transition rather than just leaving it up to the private sector. Obviously, the private sector has a huge role to play, but there are cash reserves that some of these firms are sitting on. And what we're starting to see slowly is that you know, Coal India is entering into the business of, you know, manufacturing ignots and wafers and solar PV module manufacturing facilities, and that's good. You know, with the discovery of the lithium reserve up in the north of India, I think there's a lot of question as to how long it'll take to really develop these resources that have been discovered, and who should do it. And I think that this is where the technical expertise of a large conglomerate like Coal India that has mining expertise, it would be wise for them to sort of think about their business transition plan, because that's the tension, right? Is how do these profit-making fossil fuel companies really continue to exist and be a part of the transition moving forward? And it's a rocky period, and that's why I think it's difficult to parse out, you know, what's exactly happening, where language in the international arena is pro-clean, but at the same time defensive, and it's rightly defensive because of it's the only resource that India has. But I do see a future in which these institutions are part of it and perhaps transformed.
Thank you, Karthikey. And it's really interesting here about this kind of breakdown of the energy storm. All of you sort of touched on it. We have one more potential question that we could ask, because we've all kind of talked about it tangentially, you know, some of the destabilizing events with COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war. But I'll take a pause and just offer the opportunity for audience members, if they want to send in some questions in chat that we could run through, or if you want to go ahead and ask directly. Otherwise, I'll ask one last question for any quick thoughts, and then I'll lead it off for Ope to close out the event. Okay. So as people are thinking of their thoughts, I'll just ask the question and I'll leave it open for anyone who wants to answer. We've all been hearing about kind of how COVID has have stalled a lot of the installments and developments of solar in India, and now we've been met with the Russian-Ukraine war. How has these global events affected India's clean energy goals? And what are some steps the government and industry have taken to keep the country on track to achieve these goals? It's interesting because, you know, we often hear about, at least in my news, I often hear about Western Europe, you know, suffering. But I'm curious to ask if anyone wants to jump in and talk about what is India's position? How has it been taking it?
Just jump in briefly. I mean, I followed this closely, you know, post-pandemic, and also because I've got to jump off in 2 minutes. But I mean, I think the initial sort of supply chain shocks, combined with sort of the content requirements and the taxation of certain components of the clean energy value chain did have like a combined impact on the prices at which certain auctions were won by firms to develop projects and the delays that they were facing, and then sort of missing out on the window of what they thought they could promise. And I think that did have an impact on the growth of the projected utility scale projects in particular. Now, I think there's facts and figures that my colleagues here probably could speak to a lot more. But I think, you know, just with every country since then, there's been this sort of renewed focus on trying to reshore or onshore as much of the supply chain as possible. And I think this is where some of the incentives that have really come into place and the firms have really moved on and delivering on the sort of production linked incentives in particular really will get India to a place where it will be producing a lot more of the world's solar, you know, by 2026, according to one particular research that just came out. So I think, and then the war, right? I mean, I think all the sort of 20 states having electric vehicle policies bodes well, because I don't think that India can ride the shocks of, you know, a global oil and gas market for its large population that is so price sensitive, and where it becomes a political hassle at every point to see, you know, whether or not we're going to have subsidies or taking them away. And so I think those are just things to be mindful of, and that I think has been a tightrope to walk. And I think the electrification agenda and the supply chain onshoring is part of the plan of action. With that, I'm going to stop speaking. And thank you once again.
No, wonderful, wonderful. To respect everyone's time, I'll just, you know, thank you again, and I'll hand it off to Ope to close out the event.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I don't know if Kanchi or Dhruv had any last thoughts or wanted to say anything before I close this out, but okay, so I'll close this out then. I just wanted to, again, thank you all for coming and giving us this overview of what India has been through and what is happening right now with the clean energy transition. Really appreciate your time and your thoughts. I'd like to finish us up with some announcements. Real quick, if everybody can see my slides now. Yes, okay. So first off, we have our Eastern Hub that's going to be having a conversation with the NIH Office of Science Policy tomorrow between 3 and 4 p.m. Eastern time. And so that's an opportunity for you to learn about science policy on the health side of things in the US. And then again, on Thursday next week, the Science Diplomacy Committee as well is having a pandemic diplomacy event where they're exploring the success of COVID-19 efforts with a journalist, a science officer at the UK Science Innovation Network, and a professor at the Michigan State Institute for Global Health. And then finally, there's another event next week on Thursday, April 27th, with the illustrator, animator, and designer for Scientific American, George Retzek, which is also being hosted by the Science Communication Committee. And so if you're interested in any of these, please be sure to go on our website and get more information on how to register. Again, with that, I'd say thank you to everybody who attended this meeting, and thank you very much to Kanchi and to Drew for coming by and sharing your knowledge with us. And yeah, have a great day, everybody.
Thank you so much for having us. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.